Okay, I hope I'm audible to all my students who are attending this particular lecture for the introductory microeconomics course. In this particular lecture, I'm going to start with the discussion of the 2023 question paper, which has come up at Delhi University for the introductory microeconomics course for all those students who are pursuing economics honors from University of Delhi. Okay, so let's start with the discussion of the 2023 question paper. I hope all students can see the question paper on your screens. So I'm going to solve question number 1 in this particular lecture. So let's start with the discussion of this particular lecture. So question 1, part A, all students can see on your screens. Let's quickly read this question. There are 10 workers in Australia and each can produce either 2 computers or 30 tons of rice. There are 10 workers in India and each one can produce either 5 computers or 40 tons of rice. By reading this part itself, I can say that it is based on the concept of comparative advantage, gains from trade, and production possibility curve. So see, part 1 is asking us, draw the production possibility curve for both the countries. So let's come to the whiteboard to solve this. I'm just writing the main heading for completeness. We are looking at Delhi University exam 2023 for the introductory microeconomics course. Introductory microeconomics course for all those students who are pursuing economics honors from University of Delhi. So let's look at question number 1, part A. I'm quickly writing what is given to us. We are given that there are 10 workers in Australia and there are 10 workers in India. Both have the same labor force. And we are given the requirements, unit labor requirements for producing 2 commodities, which are computers and rice. So I can say that in Australia, if I talk about 2 goods, coconut and computers and rice, okay? So there are 2 goods, computers and rice. Computers and rice. Okay, so each labor in Australia can produce 2 computers with 30 tons of rice or 30 tons of rice, and each labor in India can produce either 5 computers or 40 tons of rice. So I can say that these are my unit labor requirements. How much can one labor produce in Australia, and how much can one labor produce in India? Okay, so now we have to draw the production possibility curves for both the countries. So what is the total amount of computers which can be produced in Australia and total rice produced in Australia? So let's first of all look at the Australia's production possibilities. I can write Australia's production possibilities. So I can write if all the 10 workers, if all the 10 workers produce computers, then how many computers will be produced in Australia? 2. One labor can produce 2 computers. So 10 workers can produce 20 computers. Then 20 computers will be produced. Then 20 computers will be produced in Australia. And similarly, I can write if all the 10 workers produce rice, then one worker can produce 30 tons of rice, 10 workers will produce 300 tons of rice. So I can write then 300 tons of rice will be produced in Australia. Will be produced in Australia. That means if I look at the production possibility curve for Australia, which I'm drawing here, we have computers measured on the horizontal axis and we have rice measured on the vertical axis. If I talk about Australia, Australia can produce 20 computers. Let's say this is 20 and 300 tons of rice. Let's say this is 300. So this is Australia's production possibility frontier. Okay. What is the slope of Australia's production possibility frontier? So I can erase the initial part on the top and I can write, erasing this part off. So I can write that the Australia's production possibility frontier passes through 2 points. One point is, this is 20, 0. These are the coordinates of this point and the vertical point is 0, 300. So this is 0, 300. If I write this in terms of coordinates, this is 0, 300. So I can write Australia's production possibility frontier passes through 20, 0 and 0, 300. How do I find the slope given 2 points on a straight line? Slope is nothing but change in rice over change in computers. It's always change in y over change in x, right? Rice is good y, computers is good x. So change in rice over change in computers is how much? 300 minus 0 over 0 minus 20. So this is 300 over minus 20, which is minus 15. This is the slope of Australia's production possibility frontier. Now let's find the slope. Let's find the slope of India's production possibility frontier. And let's work out India's production possibility frontier. So if I erase all this off, students can now write the heading, India's production possibility frontier. I can write India's production possibility frontier. So if all the 10 workers in India produce computers, then how many computers will be produced? One worker in India can produce 5 computers. 10 workers will produce 50 computers. So I can say then 50 computers will be produced. 50 computers will be produced. And I can similarly write if all the 10 workers in India produce rice. Remember, one worker in India can produce 40 tons of rice. So 10 workers will produce 400 tons of rice. So I can write then 400 tons of rice will be produced. 400 tons of rice will be produced. That means in red color, if I plot the India's production possibility frontier, it will pass through 50, 0 because maximum 50 computers can be produced. So this is 50, 0. And if I stretch the vertical axis a bit, because we need space, this is rice, this is good y. On the vertical axis, we have 400 tons. 400 tons means somewhere here. This is 0, 400. If I join these 2 points, I get India's production possibility frontier. This is India's production possibility frontier, and the black one is Australia's production possibility frontier. I hope students can see this clearly. Because of lack of space, it might be a bit difficult to visualize, but let me write it like this. The black one is Australia's production possibility front. Okay, what is the slope of India's production possibility frontier? So I can first of all write that India's production possibility frontier, passes through which points? 50, 0 and 0, 400. So what is the slope of India's production possibility frontier? Again, change in rice over change in computers. So 400 minus 0 divided by 0 minus 50. So if you check it out, students, it's minus 8. So I can write that slope of India's production possibility frontier is minus 8. So if I erase all this off now, I'm erasing the table. I'm writing it here that the slope of India's production possibility frontier will be change in rice over change in computers, which has come out as minus 8. So I've drawn the production possibility frontiers. I'm drawing the table again now, just for clarity. I'm redrawing the table given to us in the question. The table was, we had Australia, we had India, we had goods. The goods were coconuts and computers and rice. Let me correct myself, computers and rice. And our labor requirements were as follows. In Australia, 2 computers or 30 tons of rice can be produced. In India, 5 computers or 40 tons of rice can be produced by one worker. Now let's come back to the question paper. We have drawn the production possibility frontier for both the countries. Which country has absolute advantage in the production of computers? Obviously, that country will have an absolute advantage in the production of computers if that country can produce more computers. So very simple. If you look at both the countries, I can write for part B, for part 2. I'm answering part 2. In Australia, one worker can produce 2 computers. One worker can produce 2 computers, and in India, one worker can produce 5 computers. That means, guys, the same labor which produces only 2 computers in Australia can produce 5 computers in India. So I can say, therefore, India has absolute advantage. India has absolute advantage in computers. Why does India have an absolute advantage in computers? Because the same worker in India can produce more computers compared to Australia. So my answer for the second part is India has an absolute advantage. Coming back to the question paper, which country has a comparative advantage in production of rice? Now for comparative advantage, we compare the slopes. Very simple. So look at the slopes. For Australia, it's minus 15. For India, it's minus 8. How do I interpret it? So I can erase this off and I can now write for part 3. I can write that slope of Australia's EPF, also called the opportunity cost. Remember, the slope of the production possibility curve also captures the opportunity cost, is minus 8, minus 15. Let me correct myself. The slope of Australia's production possibility frontier is minus 50. This means that Australia needs to sacrifice 15 tons of rice to produce one computer. Remember, it's change in rice over change in computers. So when change in rice over change in computers is minus 15, it means Australia has to sacrifice 15 tons of rice to produce one computer. And similarly, if I talk about India, I can write that the slope of India's production possibility frontier, which is nothing but the opportunity cost, is minus 8. This means what? This means that India needs to sacrifice only 8 tons of rice to produce one computer. That means if both the countries plan to produce one more computer, Australia will have to sacrifice more tons of rice to produce the same computer as compared to India. India will sacrifice only 8 tons of rice. Australia will sacrifice 15 tons of rice. That means I can say India has a comparative advantage in producing computers. Since India has to sacrifice lesser tons of rice to produce a computer, therefore India has a comparative advantage in computers. India has a comparative advantage in computers. So who has a comparative advantage in rice? If India has a comparative advantage in computers, because India has to sacrifice only 8 tons of rice to make a computer. Australia has to sacrifice more tons of rice, 15 tons of rice to make the same one computer. Since India has to sacrifice lower tons of rice to make the same computer, India has a comparative advantage in computers because India can produce computers at a lower opportunity cost compared to Australia. But if you look at rice, because the question was asking us about rice, see, the question was asking us which country has a comparative advantage in rice. Remember, two countries can't have the same, two countries cannot have the same comparative advantage in the good. So if India has a comparative advantage in computers, that means Australia has a comparative advantage in rice. I can also say that to produce one more ton of rice, Australia has to sacrifice 1 by 15 computers, whereas India has to sacrifice 1 by 8 computers. I can also write it like this. To produce 1 ton of rice, Australia, A means Australia, A needs to sacrifice 1 by 15 computers. And I can write that, similarly, if I erase this part off, I can write that this means to produce 1 ton of rice, India needs to sacrifice 1 by 8 computers. Now 1 by 15 is how much? If I look at 1 by 15, 1 divided by 15 is 0.06 approximately. So I can write 0.06 here. And 1 by 8 is how much? 0.125. So I can write 0.125. So clearly students can see that to produce 1 ton of rice, Australia needs to sacrifice lesser computers as compared to India. 0.06 is less than 0.125. Therefore, I can write since Australia has to sacrifice, let me erase this portion off. since Australia has to sacrifice lesser number of computers to produce a ton of rice, compared to India, therefore my answer is Australia has a comparative advantage. Australia has a comparative advantage in rice. This is my answer. So actually, I have given a very detailed explanation. Students could have just written that since India has a comparative advantage in producing computers, hence Australia will have a comparative advantage in rice. Because two countries cannot have the same cannot have the comparative advantage in the same good. Okay, so hoping students have understood this. This is where I stop in this particular lecture. Okay, if I come back to the question paper, I have solved part A in today's lecture. I have drawn the production possibility frontier for both the countries. I have clearly indicated that India has a comparative advantage in production of computers. And I have also indicated that Australia has a comparative advantage in India has the absolute advantage in producing computers. Australia has a comparative advantage in production of rice. Okay. In the next lecture, I'm going to discuss with all students part B of question number 1. We are going to talk about normative positive statements and their differences and all in the next lecture. So I stop in this lecture. I hope students have enjoyed this lecture. Any doubts? You can unmute your mic and ask, or you can get in touch with me for doubts on call or WhatsApp, or you can mail me your doubts at divineschoolof economics@gmail.com. This is where I stop in this lecture.